Tonight, you're not scrolling through headlines or staring at an old map of Asia. You're standing in a narrow hallway where politics learns to walk without making a sound, and the world is doing that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a river name become a border. You'll see patriotic societies behave like a shadow ministry teacups, ledgers, introductions, and you'll follow the smallest detail in ink name, a stamped envelope, a door that opens sideways until it nudges an empire. 3 small senses to hold on to: ink warming in stone, wet flagstone under a single get-a tap, and the dry tick of a telegraph behind paper shy. Something nearby keeps time, the telegraph's patient clicking slow and obedient, and if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, maybe that little telegraph tick will remember you there, half awake, while the next message travels. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a battle or a speech. It begins with a name you can write in one calm stroke: Black Dragon. Ink worms in a stone, slowly, like a kettle that doesn't want to announce itself. A single get-a taps once on wet flagstone. Somewhere behind a paper shudgy, a telegraph ticks like a small, patient heartbeat. And in the quiet space between those sounds, you can let your shoulders sink a little, because nothing here is urgent and nothing is chasing you. You might not expect an empire's shadow politics to begin with something as innocent as a river name, but it often does. A river is a line on a map until it becomes a border, and a border is a border until it becomes a story people repeat with serious faces. The Amur Hailong Jiang, the Black Dragon, runs through that kind of geography, where languages overlap and maps get handled a little too roughly. The emblem comes first because emblems are easier than explanations. After that, the names arrive: Jin Yusha, then later Kokoryukai, each of them sounding like an organization you could describe as patriotic if you speak gently and don't look too closely at the fine print. They form with the ingredients that often create these things: veterans with memories, police with contacts, merchants with ledgers, monks with networks, and a general willingness to do work that doesn't look nice on a poster. The odd calm truth is that borders shift faster when someone grips them from the shadows, and the shadow is often just a hallway with familiar footsteps. If you imagine the way these groups welcome people, it's not with fireworks. It's with a toast and a ledger, the 2 most reliable tools for turning strangers into obligations. Oaths, when they appear, tend to be short, precise, and portable loyalty. Secrecy, task first recited over tea, not trumpets. A vow is useful when it fits in a pocket. And the membership, as a practical matter, isn't always a list with names and neat ink. Sometimes it's a braid of favors, introductions, and remembered debts. I helped your friend. You introduced my cousin. We don't need to write it down because we'll feel it later. Patrons sign with donations. Officials sign with silence. Newspapers sign with column inches. The most useful membership card is a door that opens quietly at night, and the door, in a bureaucratic city, is often held shut by custom rather than locks. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let the idea settle. The most powerful pressure in politics is not always a speech. Sometimes it's a visit that happens before anyone is ready to call it a visit. When you move from symbols to methods, everything becomes less theatrical and more office-like. The tools you don't see on parade are rarely exciting to watch, which is why they work. Money has a talent for disguising itself as something harmless. A cultural club can be a room with folding chairs and a lectern, and yet it can also be a meeting point where people trade introductions the way children trade marbles, quietly, proudly, and with the sense that each one has value. A language school teaches grammar by day and roots by night, which sounds dramatic until you remember that roots can be as boring as train times and hotel addresses written in Notebook with careful handwriting. A shipping office tracks cargo and men because in the real world those two things often travel together and both can be counted. Donations leave lectures as envelopes. Stipends exit as train tickets. Budgets hide muscle under tea and printing costs because printing costs are one of history's favorite costumes. Receipts look dull on purpose. Dullness is camouflage. Dullness is comfort. Dullness is, frankly, a gift to anyone trying to fall asleep. Words, too, can be tools, and they are often sharper than anything metal while still looking polite on a page. Pamphlets soften a city before envoys land. Editors receive facts that fit tomorrow's headline with suspicious smoothness, like a suit tailored too quickly. Some messages travel as whispers. Others travel wrapped in the official language of committees and petitions. And then there are the other kinds of tools, the ones you don't want to linger on, because all they really do is make life shorter and quieter in the worst way. It's enough to say that in some corners of this world, pressure was measured in quiet visits, not in speeches, and that the corridors sometimes decided before the cabinet met. Passports flower from drawers. Names change their coats. An alias buys a map and a room. None of it requires magic. It requires paperwork, timing, and the human habit of looking away when looking would cost something. If you gently widen the view, the shadow doesn't stay inside Japan's islands. It stretches outward the way shipping schedules stretch outward, one port at a time, one rail line at a time, one rented room at a time. In Korea and Manchuria, and places where borders were not only lines but living arguments, agents could rent upstairs beds above taverns and quietly note who left with which suitcase. That sounds like a spy novel, but in practice it can be as mundane as a clerk checking names and times, because surveillance is often just a bored person writing things down. Rail yards become calendars. Ships' manifests read like small predictions. A bribe can turn a timetable into policy because policy, when it's being built in a hurry, often relies on whoever controls the schedule. Allies are found in brackish water police, brokers, gang bosses, people who trade protection for protection until the word protection starts meaning two different things depending on who says it. And the frontier moves on paper first, then on rails, then on boots that arrive right on time, because boots, like trains, respect coordination. Back home, the influence can feel almost polite from the outside. Cabinets can be haunted by courtesy. Ministers hear public sentiment before the public does, because someone has already packaged it and delivered it like a basket of fruit that you're supposed to admire. Petitions arrive with the ink still damp, and the dampness itself is a signal. This is fresh, this is urgent, this is already circulating. A threatened scandal becomes support. A promised rally becomes restraint. Elections tilt by inches funds, rumors, endorsements, none large enough alone to leave a bruise, but together enough to make outcomes feel inevitable. The trick, if you can call it that, is to steer intervals, not events, to make decisions feel like they made themselves. And if you feel any tension in that thought, you can let it dissolve into something smaller and sleepier. Most of politics is just timing, and timing is often controlled by whoever has the patience to wait in the hallway. And then history does what history always does. It changes the lighting. After 1945, the obvious structures break, or are forced to pretend to break. Headquarters close, names retire. Oaths dissolve, at least on paper, and yet address books live on in smaller print. Companies rebrand. Clubs become cultural associations. Old couriers become new intermediaries because a person who knows how to carry messages rarely forgets how. The Cold War arrives like a draft under the door, bringing new priorities and familiar guides. Information moves by hand again, not banner. Institutions forget loudly, networks forget slowly. There is a difference between we dissolved and we stopped using the old stationery. The phone still rings from the same corners. A favor is still a favor. A contact is still a contact. The world changes its slogans, but habits keep their quiet rhythm, like footsteps in a corridor you've walked 1,000 times. This is usually the moment when stories try to become dramatic. They try to announce a villain, a hero, a clear ending. But bedtime history doesn't need that. Bedtime history prefers the soft truth that people and systems rarely disappear neatly. They thin, they scatter. They mutate into committees, acquaintances, and routines. In the daylight, you might want a sharper conclusion. At night, you can accept the blur. You can picture the ledger more than the fire, the ledger that survives, because it fits in a drawer, because it looks boring, because it can be called old paperwork. If you've ever moved houses and discovered a folder you forgot you owned, you already understand how the past stays alive. It doesn't always roar. It sits, it waits, it looks like nothing until someone needs it. So here's a small bedtime oath, the kind that asks nothing heroic from you. Keep facts in one jar, friends, funds, roots labeled, light, revisable. Keep legend in another jar, more decorative, more tempting, and much easier to spell. Watch who owns schedules and ledgers, not who owns slogans, because the corridor often writes tomorrow's news long before the headline arrives. Change one small assumption in the morning. Let tonight cool the story back to evidence. The telegraph fades. The ink dries. And somewhere under ordinary paper and ordinary names, the dragon coils less like a monster, more like a system waiting for the next map, while your room stays still and you don't have to hold anything anymore. You might not expect a loop of bent wire to have a biography complete with patents, shortages, quiet symbolism, and the occasional office drawer feud, but the paperclip has spent more than a century doing small silent work that somehow keeps whole systems from sliding into chaos. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be simple. Let a soft mechanical sound like a distant fan or a refrigerator that has nothing dramatic to announce fill the corners. And if you're listening from somewhere specific, at some particular hour that feels mildly secret, you can whisper it to yourself. Where are you and what time is it right now? A paperclip is a small object that pretends it has no history, which is exactly the kind of object that usually has quite a lot of it. You've probably held one without thinking, the way you hold a spoon without thinking. Cool metal, slight spring, a shape that feels inevitable, as if it were discovered rather than invented. But invention is rarely romantic in real life. It's paperwork. Sketches, prototypes, and people trying to explain to other people why their particular loop of wire deserves legal protection. Sometime in the late 19th century, as offices grew heavier with letters, receipts, and politely terrifying forms, the need for temporary fastening became obvious. Pins were sharp and rude. String was slow and theatrical. Glue was permanent in a way that made everyone nervous. And so the paperclip arrives as a compromise. Strong enough to hold, gentle enough to let go, and socially acceptable enough to sit on a desk without looking like a weapon. The earliest paperclip designs wandered around like sleepy animals trying different postures. Some were complicated. Some were proud of being complicated. Patents appear in this era the way mushrooms appear after rain quietly, repeatedly, and in clusters. Different inventors proposed different spirals and hooks, often with the sincere belief that they had solved fastening forever. If you ever want to feel calm about human ambition, imagine a person in 1890 carefully drawing a tiny looped shape and writing pages of text explaining why it is superior. It's difficult to stay overly anxious while thinking about someone earnestly defending a wire squiggle. And yet, in their defense, small improvements in office tools can change daily life. Offices are ecosystems. If one small thing becomes easier, everything becomes slightly less irritating. which is a respectable form of progress. Eventually, one particular form becomes familiar, the double loop gem style that most people now recognize instantly. It's not flashy, it doesn't announce, it simply works. And that is sometimes the entire reason a design survives. The gem clip slips onto paper with minimal tearing, holds with a decent grip, and can be removed without leaving behind a permanent scar, unless you count the faint crease of memory in the paper fibers. It's a tool built for temporary agreements. These pages belong together, it says, but only until someone changes their mind. That's a very modern attitude, honestly, and a very bureaucratic one. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know. The paperclip will continue to exist either way, patiently waiting in drawers, unaffected by our personal choices. As offices expanded through the early 20th century, more letters, more files, more people whose job was to keep other people's paper in the correct order, the paperclip became a quiet staple. It's hard to glamorize an office supply, but the paperclip has a certain humble power. It allows the world to be sorted without being sealed. It's an object that respects revision, and revision is the beating heart of bureaucracy. A form is filled out, corrected, initialed, recorrected, and then clipped to its companions like a small family of documents trying their best. Somewhere, a clerk places a clip at the top left corner with a tiny "practice motion 1 second of physical certainty in an otherwise abstract day." Micro hook, if you want one. A paperclip is technically a reusable fastening device, which means it's an early champion of sustainable office culture, long before anyone put the word sustainable on a motivational poster and spelled it wrong. Paperclips also encouraged a certain kind of desk behavior. People began to develop small habits around them, tapping them, straightening them, bending them into tiny improvised tools. If you've ever turned a paperclip into a pin, a hook, a reset button poker, or an emergency earring situation you don't want to talk about, you've participated in the paperclip's second career, being useful in ways it never formally agreed to. The paperclip is politely obedient until it's pressed into service as a handyman. It can open a SIM tray. It can unclog a glue bottle. It can become a tiny sculpture if the meeting is long enough. It's the kind of object that quietly invites fidgeting, which is why so many paperclips have ended their lives not as clips, but as abstract modern art made by bored hands at the edge of a notebook. And then, because history cannot leave anything completely calm, the paperclip gets pulled into larger systems, industry, war, supply, symbolism, without changing its shape much at all. Steel shortages, manufacturing demands, and wartime rationing affected even humble items like clips, staples, and the kinds of paper people were allowed to waste. It's a strange way to measure a society, not only by its speeches and battles, but by whether offices can still fasten memos neatly. When resources tighten, you learn how much you've been relying on small conveniences. A shortage of paperclips doesn't sound like a crisis until you picture a mountain of unfastened paperwork slowly becoming a blizzard on someone's desk. That's not a dramatic apocalypse, but it is the kind of apocalypse that makes a manager stare into the distance for a long time. In some places, the paperclip even became a quiet symbol. During the Second World War in Norway, people reportedly wore paperclips as a small sign of solidarity and resistance, an everyday object used as a discreet badge when other symbols were risky. It is almost too gentle to be believed at first, a piece of wire as an emblem of belonging. But that's exactly why it works. It's ordinary. It's deniable. It can be explained away as just something I had, and it carries in its function a kind of metaphor. It binds separate pages together. It says, we're connected. It's difficult to imagine a more understated message. No banners. No slogans. Just a small loop of metal pinned to a lapel, doing its quiet job of holding something in place. If you feel your mind wanting to wander, let it. Think of someone, years ago, choosing the least dramatic object possible as a sign and finding comfort in its smallness. The global life of the paperclip is also a story of standards and near standards, an endless sleepy negotiation between what people prefer and what factories can produce. Clips come in sizes, they come in coatings. Some are smooth. Some are vinyl covered and slightly squishy, like they want to be friendly. Some are triangular. Some are shaped like stars, which is a brave aesthetic choice for an object that lives in a drawer most of the time. And yet, even in their variety, they all serve the same purpose: temporary order. Offices, schools, governments, and businesses bought paper clips in bulk because the future always contains more paper than you think it will. This is one of history's quiet jokes. Every generation believes it is approaching a paperless era and then produces more paper as if to celebrate the prediction's failure. As filing systems evolved, folders, cabinets, index cards, later photocopies, later printers that never stopped printing, the paperclip remained steady. It's a weak technology in one sense because it doesn't scale dramatically. It doesn't transform the world with speed. It simply repeats a small action reliably. But reliability is what makes an object culturally sticky. The paperclip became part of office language. Clip this to that. Keep these together. Don't lose this. Why is there a paperclip in the hallway? Who keeps eating all the paper clips? Which is a question you ask only once before you decide not to investigate. Microhook, gently silly. Paper clips have been used in experiments and puzzles, and even as tiny makeshift tools in science classrooms, which means a humble clip may have participated in more education than some textbooks, mostly by being dropped on the floor at exactly the wrong moment. And then, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the paperclip got a strange digital afterlife. It became an icon. The little paperclip symbol in email interfaces buries an attachment, turned a physical object into a metaphor for invisible files, which is very calming if you think about it. Our digital world still borrows comfort from older desk objects. We don't say, here is a data payload. We say, here is a paperclip. We don't say, this message contains an additional file transfer. We say, it's clipped. Even when paper disappears, the language of fastening remains. The paperclip moves from desk to screen without demanding a new personality. It's still a signal of togetherness, just translated into pixels. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the modern office, keyboards, printers, the soft distress of someone trying to find that one document, and somewhere in a drawer, paper clips waiting like polite spare parts. Some offices try to replace them with binder clips, which are louder and prouder and tend to snap your finger with a tiny judgment if you read careless. Some offices try to replace them with staples, which are permanent and slightly aggressive. Some try to replace them with digital folders, which is a lovely fantasy until someone names the folder New Final, Really Final 2 and loses their soul. The paperclip, by contrast, doesn't care what you name anything. It simply holds quietly and then releases. Now, if you want to settle even further into sleep, you can let the paperclip become a small meditation on temporary order. Breathe in for 4, out for 6. Imagine a stack of pages that want to drift apart and a clip that says, gently, not yet. There's something soothing in that message. Not forever. Not permanently. Just not yet. It's the same feeling as putting a bookmark in a book, or folding a corner of a page small acts of control that down to solve your entire life. The paperclip doesn't promise to fix chaos. It promises to make the chaos slightly more manageable for the length of a meeting. And after all the patents and offices and shortages and symbols and icons, the paperclip's ending is always the same. It returns to the drawer. It waits. It occasionally tangles with its neighbors in a way that suggests they've been gossiping. It sometimes bends out of shape and becomes less useful, and then it gets tossed into a small container of miscellaneous metal things, where it will live out the rest of its days among broken staples and tiny screws that belonged to something important once. It's a humble afterlife. It's also, in its own way, peaceful. Not everything needs a monument. Some things just need a place to rest. So you can let the story fade here softly without a major conclusion because the paperclip never needed one. It is still out there, holding pages in schools, in hospitals, in quiet offices, in someone's kitchen where receipts pile up like gentle accusations. It is still being used as a tool it was never meant to be. It is still appearing as a small symbol on screens, reminding us that even digital life wants to feel physically held. And if your thoughts are loosening, that's perfectly fine. The paperclip will continue doing its small work without you watching. The room can stay still. The air can stay quiet. Somewhere unseen, a thin loop of metal holds 2 pages together for a little while longer, and that is more than enough reason to let your mind unclench and drift and sleep. You might not expect the weight of the world to spend most of its life under 3 glass bell jars, sitting quietly in a vault, doing almost nothing. Yet for a long time, that was essentially the job description of the kilogram. If your room is calm, let it stay calm. Let the air be simple. Imagine a soft, steady hum somewhere in the background and a desk lamp that refuses to be dramatic. And if you're listening from a specific place, at a specific hour that feels a little private, you can whisper it to yourself, where are you? And what time is it? The story begins with a very gentle human problem. We like things to match. We like a meter to mean a meter, and a kilogram to mean a kilogram. Not a kilogram in this town, and a kilogram-ish in that town, depending on the mood of the merchant and the weather. For most of history, weights and measures were local, which meant that you could travel a short distance and discover that reality had changed shape slightly. Flour was sold by one standard here, another standard there, and if you were unlucky, you learned the difference only after you had already paid. This was not usually framed as philosophical chaos. It was framed as annoying. And annoyance, in the long run, is one of the strongest forces in history. Revolutions get the headlines, but irritation does a lot of the daily pushing. So slowly and deliberately, people tried to standardize. France, in particular, took the idea seriously around the time it was reorganizing many other things with a sharp pencil. The metric system arrives with the soothing promise that units should be based on nature, not tradition. In theory, that's comforting. In practice, it means you have to make a definition that can be repeated, checked, and used by ordinary humans with ordinary equipment. A kilogram was originally tied to water, the mass of a certain volume of water at a certain temperature, because water is universal and seems polite enough to cooperate. But water is also quietly a bit moody. Temperature changes, purity changes. Air pressure exists. Water refuses to be the perfectly calm reference it looks like from a distance. So eventually, the world did the most human thing possible. It made a physical object and said, this is what we mean. That object became a small cylinder of platinum iridium alloy, because platinum is stable, precious, and has the personality of a very serious doorman. The cylinder was made in the late 1800s and stored near Paris at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures BIP, where it lived an extremely quiet life. If you picture it, don't picture a glamorous treasure. Picture a small metal canister about the size that would make you say, oh, that's it. It sat under nested glass bell jars, like a sleepy museum exhibit that wasn't meant to be seen by anyone. It had no interest in being inspirational. It just needed to be consistent. What's charmingly absurd is that the kilogram, the supposedly universal thing, was, for a while, literally one specific object. If you wanted to know what a kilogram really was, at the deepest official level, You were talking about a particular cylinder in a particular place. It's the kind of arrangement that feels both calming and slightly ridiculous. Calming because it's concrete. Ridiculous because your entire planet's sense of 1 kilogram is now effectively depending on a small piece of metal not having a bad day. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, I'll never know. The kilogram will continue to sit quietly in its bell jars either way, unimpressed by our level of commitment. The cylinder didn't live alone either, which is where the story becomes gently social. Copies, official prototypes, were distributed to other countries. Not casual copies, but carefully made, carefully handled siblings, each with its own identity and paperwork. Imagine a family of nearly identical metal cylinders, each one traveling to a different nation, each one becoming the most boring celebrity in its region. These national prototypes were stored in their own guarded places and brought out only for serious comparison, like a royal relative who appears only for ceremonies and then returns to a private life of silence. Comparisons were important because over time, even stable metal objects can drift in tiny ways. Not dramatically. No one woke up one morning to discover the kilogram had doubled. Drift in metrology is more subtle than that. It's the slow, quiet accumulation of microscopic changes, contamination, surface chemistry, cleaning methods, the faint presence of the world. And the truth that makes this topic perfect for sleep is that the biggest suspense in this story is not an explosion, it's a few micrograms. A speck. A whisper of mass. The most intense drama here is a laboratory technician noticing that two objects that should match perfectly do not, and then feeling in their soul the gentle horror of we need to investigate. To keep things consistent, the prototypes were periodically compared. This was done with immense care, because touching the kilogram like it as a normal object would be like using a priceless painting as a placemat. In metrology, the act of measuring can change what you measure, which is a very polite little paradox. The cylinder's surface could pick up a thin film of something from the air, or it could lose something, or it could be cleaned slightly differently from last time. In the world of everyday life, these changes are meaningless. In the world of defining the kilogram, they are the entire plot. There's even a famously careful cleaning process that has been described for platinum iridium standard special cloths. Specific solvents, methodical strokes, because the cylinder had to be clean, but cleaning itself can remove tiny layers. It is like trying to keep a very dignified statue spotless while also not wearing it down with attention. Somewhere in history, humans invented an object so important that the safest way to preserve it was to mostly leave it alone. That's a deeply sleepy lesson. Sometimes stability is just respectful distance. Meanwhile, the world kept building, trading, manufacturing, calibrating. Science and industry needed the kilogram, even if they never saw the original cylinder. Laboratories had their own standards. Companies had calibrated weights. Scales were checked and rechecked. And all of that quietly leaned on the idea that somewhere, under glass, the kilogram was still being itself. It's a strange kind of trust network, a global chain of measurements that relies on a tiny object resting in a calm room. If you like subtle modern analogies, it's a bit like how people trust time zones without knowing who actually maintains them. You don't meet the person who keeps your phone's clock accurate. You just assume the world is doing its quiet work. Eventually, metrologists faced an uncomfortable question. What if the kilogram isn't perfectly stable? Not because it's failing, but because it's a physical object in a physical universe? What if, over decades, the original cylinder and its copies don't agree exactly? If they disagree, which one is the kilogram? The answer used to be both simple and unsettling. The original is the definition, so it wins by authority. If something else drifts, it's the something else that's wrong. And yet, if the definition itself changes, if the cylinder gains or loses mass, then the kilogram changes silently with it. That means the unit that is supposed to anchor reality becomes, in a tiny way, a moving boat on very calm water. Still calm, still usable, but philosophically annoying. And again, irritation is a powerful force. So the metrology world did what it does. It worked, slowly, patiently, without needing applause. The goal became to redefine the kilogram, not by a specific object, but by a fundamental constant of nature, something that doesn't sit in a vault and doesn't have to be cleaned. That idea sounds abstract, but it is actually very practical if you read the kind of person who enjoys practical abstraction. In the end, the kilogram was redefined by fixing the value of the Planck constant, linking mass to a constant through physical relationships that can be realized with specialized equipment. One of the key tools in this transition was the Kibble balance, formerly known as a watt balance, which lets you tie mass measurements to electrical measurements in a controlled way. If that sounds like it should be stressful, don't let it be. In the bedtime version of this story, it is simply another example of humans trying to nail down a definition so gently that it stops shifting under their fingertips. There's something almost tender about the idea that for a long time, the kilogram was an object you could, in theory, point to, but in practice, you weren't allowed to point too close. It lived protected like a small, extremely important secret. And then, quietly, the world decided it would rather define the kilogram in a way that doesn't require a sacred cylinder at all. The cylinder still exists, of course. It didn't vanish. It didn't retire with a dramatic speech. It simply became what it always was, a beautifully made reference object with historical importance. In other words, it went from being the kilogram to being a kilogram-shaped elder with an impressive resume. If you let your mind drift over this, you can notice how soothing it is that some of the most important human achievements are not loud. They are careful, they are slow. They are built out of committees, lab notes, repeated trials, and people speaking softly over instruments that hum. The kilogram story contains no cavalry charges, no shouting, no cliffhangers. It contains a vault. It contains glass. It contains a small cylinder that spent decades being protected from fingerprints. If you want a tiny microhub to carry you a little further into drowsiness, somewhere on Earth, there are still people whose job includes thinking seriously about dust. And if that sounds almost too gentle, that's because it is. The real triumph here is that the world agreed to share a definition. Agreement is harder than invention. Anyone can make a clever object. It takes a different kind of patience for many countries, many laboratories, and many industries to say, yes, we will all use this. It's the quiet unity of measurement. You can imagine the calm ripple effects, factories making parts that fit, scientists comparing results, pharmacies measuring doses, kitchens and markets behaving slightly more predictably than they otherwise might. None of that requires you to stay awake. It simply happens because long ago, people decided a kilogram should stop being a local opinion and start being a shared fact. So the bell jars remain in their quiet room. The old cylinder remains, resting like an artifact from a time when the world anchored a unit to a thing you could, hypothetically, touch if you had the right permissions and the right gloves and the right reasons. And the modern definition remains out in the universe, tied to constants that don't need a vault. If your thoughts are loosening now, let them loosen. You don't need to remember the names, the dates, or the instruments. You can just remember the feeling. A small metal object sleeping under glass and a planet choosing patiently to make 1 kilogram mean the same thing everywhere. The lamp stays low. The air stays still. The world keeps its gentle measurements in the background, and you can let your attention fade the way a number fades when you stop trying to hold it until there's nothing left to count at all. You might not expect an entire department of government to exist mostly for the purpose of opening other people. A smile and sign quietly, but for a very long time, that was the calm, methodical job of the dead letter office. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the air be ordinary. Let the sounds in the distance, fan, fridge, rain, the soft click of something settling do their small, predictable work. And if you're listening from somewhere specific, at a time that feels private, you can whisper it to yourself. Where are you? And what time is it? The comforting thing about letters is that they look like they know where they're going. A rectangle of paper, an address. A stamp, like a tiny paid permission slip. In the imagination, a letter travels in a straight line from one hand to another, politely, like a well-trained messenger. In reality, mail has always been a little more chaotic, because humans are chaotic and handwriting is, at best, a friendly guess. People misspell towns, they forget house numbers. They write, near the big oak, as if the whole world shares their particular oak. They address envelopes to Mr. John, the tall one, which is daringly optimistic. And sometimes they do everything correctly and the world still misplaces the letter anyway because the world is full of bags, carts, trains, sorting tables, weather, and tired clerks who have been staring at cursive for 9 hours and are starting to see ghosts in the loops. So the dead letter is born, not dead like a tragedy, more dead like a sock that went missing in the laundry. A small disappearance, a quiet administrative mystery. A letter that cannot be delivered becomes, for the system, a problem that must be handled without personal drama. The post office can't simply throw it into a river like a villain in a melodrama. It has procedures, it has rules. It has the institutional personality of someone who would rather file something than feel something. And that is exactly what makes the dead letter office such a sleepy topic. It is the place where lost hopes, miswritten directions, and awkward human mistakes are processed with paperwork and careful routine. In many countries, especially as postal systems grew in the 19th century, undeliverable mail was gathered and sent to a central office. In the United States, people often call it the dead letter office historically, though the name and structure changed over time. Britain had its own versions, as did other places with large bureaucracies and a high tolerance for envelopes. These offices were where letters went when they had nowhere else to go, like a quiet waiting room for paper. A mail carrier tries. A local postmaster tries. The letter returns stamped with polite failure. Eventually, it is bundled with other stubborn envelopes and shipped off to the place where stubborn envelopes go to be studied. There is something almost tender in the idea that a government employed people whose job was to look at an envelope and think, slowly and carefully, what did this person mean? Imagine the scene, long tables, piles of paper, the faint smell of ink and adhesive, the hush of work that requires concentration but provides no applause. Clerks examine addresses. They compare handwriting. They consult lists of towns. They try to interpret a smudged name that looks like 3 different names at once. They become, in a way, professional guessers, and their guesses often had to be logged because in a bureaucracy, even intuition needs to form. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or don't. I'll never know. But somewhere in the long history of mail, a clerk has absolutely written illegible with a firmness that suggests they felt personally betrayed by the sender as penmanship, and there's something gently funny about that. A whole system can run on politeness until someone writes like a re-signing a contract while riding a horse. When the outside of a letter wasn't enough, the office had rules about opening it. This is where the story could try to become dramatic, but we're not going to let it. It's not a spy thriller. It's a filing cabinet with feelings it refuses to admit. The basic logic was usually, if a letter can to be delivered, and it can to be returned to the sender, the office may open it to look for clues inside. A return address tucked in a letter, a note saying, "Tell Aunt Mary," a business name, a card, anything. The opening itself could be done under specific supervision by authorized staff with records, because even when a system is trying to help, it still likes to protect itself legally. Bureaucracy is, among other things, a way to avoid being blamed later. And inside these letters, this is where the microhooks live. There were often quiet little surprises. Some were ordinary. A love note, a bill, a family update about someone's cough. Some were intensely boring in the most historical way. Receipts, contracts, notices, letters complaining about other letters. And some were strange, because humans are strange, and the mail is one of the few places where people will confidently send small oddities with the assumption that they will arrive intact. Over time, dead letter offices became known for accumulating an unofficial museum of misplaced objects. Coins, jewelry, photographs, keys with no doors. Sometimes food, which is always a bold decision. Sometimes items that had clearly been mailed with the belief that surely the post office can handle this. A sentence that has led many objects to their quiet doom. The postal system, especially in the age of growing commerce, was also full of money sent through the mail. People mailed cash, people mailed checks, people mailed payment in coins wrapped in paper, which makes a nice crinkly sound but also makes theft easier, while also tempting fate. And when money went undeliverable, the dead letter office had to handle it in a way that was both careful and deeply boring. Money had to be recorded, stored, possibly returned, possibly claimed, possibly held for a set amount of time, possibly turned over to the state if no one claimed it. There is a special kind of calm absurdity in imagining a government office where a drawer contains unclaimed coins and no one is allowed to call it treasure because it's not treasure. It's a ledger problem. At some point, you can almost feel the postal system's personality. It wants to be helpful, but it also wants to be fair, and fairness requires rules. And rules require time, and time requires more paper. The dead letter becomes not just an envelope, but a process. Whenever the system touches your letter, it leaves a small trace, stamps, marks, labels indicating attempted delivery, notes like unknown, moved, refused, insufficient address. Each mark is a tiny story told in bureaucratic shorthand. If romance novels were written by postal clerks, they would be 100 pages of stamps. It also becomes a story about addresses and how addresses evolve. Street numbers, for example, were not always as standardized as we imagine. Some towns had naming systems that changed, or streets renamed, or new buildings added, or old buildings divided into multiple dwellings. People moved, people left, people forgot to tell anyone, and the postal system had to keep up. This is the constant sleepy battle of administration. Reality changes, paperwork tries to catch up, reality changes again. If you want a modern analogy that is soft and quiet, think of your email spam folder. The system tries to guess what you mean. Sometimes it guesses wrong. Sometimes something important sits in a quiet corner, waiting to be discovered, slightly offended. Another micro-hook, gently silly. People have always tried to hack the postal system in small ways. They leave vague notes. They rely on nicknames. They assume the mail carrier will know. Sometimes they do. In small communities, carriers knew everyone. Oh, that's old Mr. Harris, the one with the limping dog. In large cities, with endless blocks and endless names, the system becomes less personal and more algorithmic, but with paper instead of code. Sorting clerks learn patterns. They learn abbreviations. They learn the geography of mistakes. A smudged ST might mean street or saint. A hurried new might be the beginning of New York or New Jersey or new something else entirely. In these offices, the ability to interpret a messy envelope becomes a skill like reading tea leaves, except the tea leaves are just ink and human optimism. Meanwhile, because the postal system had to move enormous volumes of mail, it depended on sorting innovations. Hand sorting gave way to more organized methods, standardized formats, machines, and eventually coding systems. But even with improvements, the dead letter never truly disappears. It just changes costumes. In earlier times, the dead letter might be an envelope with confusing penmanship. Later, it might be a parcel with a torn label. Later still, it might be something with a barcode that was printed too lightly, like a shy machine whisperer. And the quiet truth is, as long as humans write addresses, humans will also write addresses incorrectly. The dead letter office had another role that is both charming and slightly heartbreaking. But we all keep it soft. It was a place where some messages simply never found their person. A soldier's letter that missed its destination, a family notice, a business contract that arrived too late. These aren't dramatic in the way movies want them to be, because the office didn't experience them as drama. It experienced them as inventory, items in a bin, cases to be processed. But sometimes a letter would be successfully traced and delivered, and the office would have done something quiet and meaningful without ever receiving a thank you note, because the system isn't built for thank yous. It's built for throughput. What happened to unclaimed letters depended on the laws and the era. Many systems held mail for a fixed period, then returned it if possible, then destroyed it if not, sometimes after removing money or valuables and recording them. The idea of destroying mail sounds harsh, but it's also a practical necessity. A postal system cannot become an eternal storage unit for every misaddressed envelope ever written, even if it might be historically fascinating. Also, the smell would be complicated. Paper ages. Glue ages. People mail odd things. No one wants a warehouse full of centuries of undeliverable cheese. Sometimes, though, systems did publish lists of dead letters' names and partial addresses so that senders or recipients could claim them. Imagine flipping through a newspaper and seeing a list of names under the heading Dead Letters, like a quiet roll call of missing messages. It's an odd ritual, a public announcement that says, someone tried to reach you, it didn't work. If you want this, speak up. It's like the world leaving you a small note about another note. There's a strange gentleness in that, if you don't stare too hard. And if you do stare too hard, just let your eyes relax again. That time history doesn't need to turn into existential philosophy. As time moved on, the postal dead letter function took on more formal names and procedures. In the US, for example, the modern concept includes the Mail Recovery Center for Undeliverable Mail, which is a name that sounds less gothic and more corporate, as if the mail is going through a wellness program. Recovery is a very kind word. It implies the mail is healing. In reality, it's still paper in bins, still parcels with missing labels, still the same old problem. Something was sent, and the system is trying patiently to figure out what to do with it. And the items found in undeliverable mail became their own small folklore. People love to imagine the strange contents. Sometimes the stories are exaggerated, because humans enjoy exaggeration more than they enjoy admitting that most mail is bells. But even in ordinary mail, there is a quiet charm, a postcard from a place someone once visited, carrying a sentence that meant something on a particular sunny day, a photograph, a child's drawing, a recipe copied by hand. Micro hook. It is genuinely possible that the most emotionally sincere sentence a person ever wrote ended up in a dead letter bin because they forgot a zip code. History is full of big tragedies, but it is also full of tiny clerical ones. If you want a calmer angle, think of the dead letter office as a portrait of the world's attempt to be orderly. It's a system designed to move messages reliably across distance. It usually works. When it fails, it doesn't throw a tantrum. It creates a department. The department creates procedures. The procedures create logs. The logs create calm. And inside that calm, humans do their very small best. They look at addresses. They consult reference books. They make guesses. They place envelopes into appropriate categories. They decide when to hold, when to return, when to dispose, when to catalog. It's not heroic. It's not cinematic. It's the kind of competence that keeps civilization from slipping on its own shoelaces. And now, without needing a strong conclusion, you can let the whole topic soften into a simple image. A quiet room filled with envelopes that have nowhere to go, waiting under fluorescent light that hums politely. A clerk turns one over in their hands, looking for a clue. The paper is slightly worn from travel. The ink is slightly smudged from weather. Somewhere inside, a message sits patiently, not angry, just paused. And outside the window, the world keeps moving. People keep writing. People keep forgetting details, and the postal system keeps doing its gentle work of trying again. If your thoughts are loosening, let them loosen. You don't need to remember names of offices or specific years. You can just keep the feeling, messages moving, sometimes failing, then being handled by a quiet bureaucracy that treats even misplaced words as something worth processing. The room stays still. The air stays soft. And somewhere in a tray, a letter waits, just paper, just ink. Just a small human attempt to reach across distance, resting long enough for your mind to stop sorting anything at all. You might not expect a wall of tiny wooden drawers to remember the reading habits of an entire city, but for a long time, that was what the card catalog quietly tried to do. If your room is calm, let it stay calm. Let the most interesting sound be something small and repetitive, a clock that isn't in a hurry, a fan that has made peace with its own hum. And if you feel like it, you can whisper a little to yourself. Where are you and what time is it in this particular chapter of your own evening? Picture a library before screens, before beeping barcode scanners, before that soft, polite due date slip printed by a machine. The building might be grand or modest, but somewhere inside there is almost always the same piece of furniture, a long cabinet of drawers, each one just wide enough to fit a row of cards. The catalog sits near the entrance like a quiet gatekeeper. Every book, every map, every pamphlet the library admits is turned into data on paper. Title, author, subject headings, call number, sometimes a note. All typed or written out on cards that are from a distance, almost indistinguishable from one another. The effect is both impressive and slightly ridiculous, like watching a very orderly forest where every tree insists it is unique, but only if you come close enough to read the bark. The earliest versions weren't as standardized as the later ones. Libraries had always tried to keep list-bound catalogs, handwritten inventories, ledgers that hoped nothing would happen to them. But bound catalogs age poorly in a living library. Every new book makes the list more obsolete. You can't easily insert a volume that didn't exist when the ledger was written, so the card emerges as a small mechanical miracle. You can add cards, remove cards, shuffle cards, interfile cards. A library becomes not just a building with shelves. It becomes a kind of card factory, always making tiny paper doorways into its own collection. If you're still awake by the time I get to the debate over card size, feel free to subscribe. But honestly, don't strain yourself. Librarians already did all the straining a century ago, so you don't have to. Surprising amount of thought went into those sizes. In the 19th century, several standards were proposed, argued over, adopted, and occasionally stubbornly ignored. Too small, and the cards are fussy and hard to handle. Too large, and the drawers become unwieldy. Eventually, dimensions like 3 by 5 inches and 7.5 x 12.5 centimeters became common in different places. Not because they were mystical, but because they were practical and happened to fit most people's hands. Somewhere, a committee meeting once existed in which grown adults seriously debated whether 12.5 centimeters was too tall for optimal flipping. It's difficult to stay tense while imagining that dot The card itself had to be sturdy enough to survive thousands of touches. Every time someone looked up a book, a card might be flipped, pushed, or slightly misaligned. Multiply that by years and by the number of readers in a busy city, and you begin to understand why librarians developed very specific cardstock preferences. Too flimsy and the cards curled. Too thick and the drawers jammed like traffic. Some catalogs added tiny metal rods through the bottom of the cards, threaded through punched holes as an anti-theft measure. You could flip the cards, but you couldn't easily smuggle them out without tools and a suspicious level of determination. The idea that someone would steal catalog cards might sound absurd, but it did happen, especially for books that were constantly in demand. If you remove the card, in theory, the book becomes harder to find, and therefore easier to keep. Petty Sabotage, Library Edition. But most of the time, the card catalog was not involved in intrigue. It was involved in repetition. Staff created cards for each book, one for the author entry, one for the title entry, one or more for subject entries. A single book could generate a small family of cards that then had to be filed in different sections. Many librarians spent large portions of their careers writing, typing, correcting, and filing these cards. Each keystroke had to be accurate because a single missing letter could send a reader on an unnecessary scavenger hunt. This made cataloging both high stakes and deeply monotonous, a combination that would drive some people mad and others into a kind of meditative resilience. Over time, rules emerged to keep everything consistent. Cataloging codes told librarians how to decide which subject headings to use, how to treat middle names, how to handle titles that began with the A or their equivalents in other languages. Do you file the history of fish under H for history, or F for fish, or T for the? Someone had to decide, and once they decided, they wrote it down in a manual so others could follow. The manuals grew. They evolved. The Library of Congress and other institutions published their own rules. Subject headings became a controlled vocabulary, which is a phrase that sounds ominous but mostly just means we've chosen these words. Please use these and not 47 others that mean the same thing. Card catalogs taught librarians not only what books they had, but also how to think about them in standardized categories, like a group mind for classification. In a way, the catalog transformed the act of entering a library. You didn't wander aimlessly unless you wanted to, which was always allowed. You approached the drawers like an oracle, except the oracle wanted you to understand Boolean logic. Open the author drawer. Find the right section of the alphabet. Flip until you hit the name you want. If you misjudge, move backward or forward. The rhythm is soothing. Slide, flip, slide, flip. Each card you pass is a small printed whisper of another book you might, but probably won't read. I exist, it says politely. Perhaps another time. Then you find the card you need. It gives you a call number, a sort of address on the shelves. The catalog hasn't given you the book. It has given you directions. You must then carry those directions in your head, or on a scrap of paper, across the room or up the stairs, through aisles, until you locate the correct shelf. If the book is missing when you get there, the catalog has done nothing wrong. It is describing the ideal state of the library, not the current one. Reality is allowed to lag. There's something pleasantly philosophical about that. A card catalog is basically a machine for saying, in theory, this exists. As libraries grew, they developed multiple approaches to catalogs. Some had separate sets of drawers for authors, titles, and subjects. Others combine them, a technique that feels efficient but can make searching slightly chaotic. Some libraries had separate public catalogs for readers and more detailed staff catalogs in back rooms. The staff catalogs might contain extra notes, acquisition dates, earlier editions, hints about condition. It's like the difference between the main menu of a restaurant and the handwritten notebook the chef keeps in the kitchen. On the front side, things are clear and pleasant. On the back side, things are scribbled but informative. There's a gently absurd fact. For a long time, card production was industrial. Central institutions printed and distributed cards for widely held books so that individual libraries wouldn't have to type everything themselves. In the United States, the Library of Congress sold pre-printed catalog cards that could be purchased and filed locally. That meant that somewhere, entire teams were devoted to making perfect little rectangles of information about thousands upon thousands of titles and shipping them out in bundles. Imagine opening a package that contains nothing but a few hundred cards, all smelling faintly of fresh ink, each one ready to slide into a drawer and pretend it has always lived there. It's the literary version of buying frozen bread dough instead of meeting from scratch card catalogs. Were also physical design projects. The cabinets had to be sturdy, smooth, and dimensionally stable. What expands and contracts with humidity, which in a crowded reading room is not an abstract concern. A drawer that worked beautifully in winter might stick in summer. Some cabinets were masterpieces of carpentry with brass pulls and label frames. Others were more utilitarian, metal and laminate, built for easy cleaning rather than admiration. But almost all had that distinctive grid of fronts, each one tagged with a range of letters or subjects, a kind of analog search interface. You could see across the room sometimes the catalog took over entire walls. In big institutions, it formed a kind of paper horizon line, stretching as far as your eye could follow. For a first-time visitor, it might have looked intimidating, as if only initiated initiates knew how to touch those drawers correctly. For regular users, it was familiar, like the face of a friend who always looks serious but is secretly delighted you've arrived. The key thing was that the catalog didn't judge. If you misfiled a card by accident, it would sit there patiently until someone noticed. Some librarians kept a misplaced cards box to hold the casualties of distraction. The longer a catalog existed, the more history it absorbed. Cards yellowed. Some were replaced. Others remained, bearing traces of old typewriter ribbons and hand corrections. A librarian might decide after many years that a book's subject headings needed updating to reflect new terminology. Instead of rewriting the whole card, they might add a note or a cross-reference. The drawer slowly became a palimpsest of cataloging practice, a timeline hidden in plain sight. If you flipped to the back of a section, you could sometimes find the fossil record of older entries, handwritten cards, odd abbreviations, even a few small pencil marks that someone forgot to erase decades ago. Yet, for all its diligence, the catalog had limitations. Browsing by subject required a certain patience and the willingness to accept that someone else had decided which subjects mattered. Looking for books on tea trade. You might have to check under commerce, then under tea, then perhaps under specific regions. Modern keyword searching has spoiled us. Card catalogs did not respond well to vague wishes like books about that king who liked clocks. Unless a very sympathetic librarian acted as translator, the shift to digital systems came gradually. At first, computers were used to maintain internal databases while the card catalog remained a public face. This meant that staff did double work for a while, entering records and also creating cards. Then, slowly, terminals appeared where the card cabinets once stood. For a time, both systems might coexist, like overlapping eras in archaeology, each layer telling a slightly different version of the same story. Some patrons trusted the cards more. They liked the physicality, the sense that the catalog didn't depend on electricity. Others embraced the speed of typing a few letters and getting a list instantly. Behind the scenes, librarians had long been dreaming of the day when new entries wouldn't require typing the same data 3 times. And eventually, in many places, the card catalogs were retired. Weeding the catalog, removing cards for withdrawn, books didn't make as much sense when updates could be done digitally. The cabinets started to feel like furniture from an older house that no one wanted to repaint, but also no longer needed. What to do with them became its own quiet problem. Some were moved to storage. Some were donated or sold. A few were repurposed, turned into craft storage, seed libraries, art installations. In these reincarnations, the drawers held beads, nails, spices, anything small that needed sorting. The catalog lived on as a piece of organizational technology. Even if the cards were gone, there are stories of libraries letting patrons take old cards as souvenirs, a kind of farewell to an era. People kept them as bookmarks, framed them, made collages. There is an undeniably cozy feeling in holding a card that once represented a book's only official footprint in the catalog. It's like shaking hands with a ghost of organization. The book may still be on the shelf, now represented by an invisible database entry, but the card is proof that someone once spent time thinking about the exact right subject headings for it. Perhaps worrying about punctuation and complete silence dot in some places, card catalogs remain, either because resources make digital conversion slow, or because the catalog is considered part of the library's character. They stand there, drawers slightly worn, waiting in case someone needs them. There is no rush. Card catalogs are natural experts at not rushing. Even when they were heavily used, their speed was determined by the person flipping the cards, not by any internal urgency. That's what makes them suitable for bedtime. History. They are a technology that never tries to be exciting dot, so you can let the image settle. A long row of wooden drawers, each one full of small, carefully typed cards. A reader walks up, pulls a drawer halfway, rests it on its catch, and begins to flip with soft fingertip taps. The quiet rustle is almost like leaves in a very disciplined forest. Somewhere under the fluorescent lights, a librarian updates a record, slotting a new card into its correct space, nudging its neighbors gently aside. The system holds. The books wait. Nothing explodes. No alarms ring. If your thoughts are starting to float, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to remember the cataloging codes, the meeting minutes about card size, or the debates over subject vocabulary. You can just keep the feeling of order you didn't have to maintain yourself. Somewhere, for many years, people made sure that a stranger could walk in from the street, think of a book, and, by following the quiet logic of drawers and cards, actually find it. That's more than enough story for one night. Let the cabinets recede into the dimness of the stacks. Let the labels blur. The drawers close themselves with a soft wooden click, and everything that needs to be remembered is written down somewhere, so you don't have to hold anything in your head except the general permission to stop searching and drift. You might not expect an entire office to exist just for letters that failed at being letters, but for a long time, that was a very real job with very real desks and very real dust. If your room is still, let it stay that way. Let the smallest sounds be the main event for a while. Maybe the soft shift of fabric when you settle in, or the faint click of a radiator deciding it has done enough for the night dot. And if you'd like, just for a moment, you can answer the quiet question in your head. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there exactly in the plain, unimpressive geography of your evening dot? Now imagine a city that runs on paper. Not metaphorically, literally. Addresses, stamps, receipts, permits, notices, tickets, notes folded into triangles, and letters sealed with wax that smells faintly like heat and patience. The postal system is a beautiful, boring machine that works because most people write the name of a street correctly, and most streets agree to remain in the same place. But the machine also produces leftovers, letters with smudged ink, parcels with a missing house number, Notes addressed to Mr. John near the big church, as if churches came in only one size and men named John only lived in one neighborhood. Those leftovers had to go somewhere. So they did. They drifted like tired paper birds into a place with a name that sounds like it should be haunted, but is mostly just staffed, the dead letter office. Depending on the country and the century, it might have been tucked inside a grand post office building or hidden behind ordinary doors near sorting rooms. The point was simple. When a letter couldn't be delivered and couldn't be returned, it didn't vanish. It was rerouted into a slow, quiet afterlife of procedures. There is a strange comfort in that. The postal system, at its best, refuses to accept mystery as an end state. If something doesn't make sense, it is not immediately abandoned. It is placed on a different shelf. It is given a form. It is assigned a clerk. And if you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. Or don't. I'll never know. The dead letter office certainly wouldn't tell me. It would just file that information under undeliverable, stamp it, and move on. The reasons letters ended up there were often painfully small. People moved and forgot to tell anyone. Towns had repeating street names because originality was not always a priority in municipal planning. Ink ran in the rain. Handwriting, which can be charming on a love note, becomes less charming when it determines whether a parcel of socks ends up in the right county. Sometimes letters were addressed in a kind of hopeful shorthand. To my cousin in London, which is emotionally efficient but geographically useless. Sometimes the sender forgot to include the return address, as if the letter itself would remember who wrote it. Paper is loyal, but not that loyal dot in many systems. The first goal was always return. If a letter couldn't be delivered, it was supposed to go back to the sender because that's the polite thing to do. The trouble was that senders also made mistakes, or they deliberately stayed vague, or they lived in a place where addresses were more like suggestions. So the letter arrived at the dead letter office not as a dramatic mystery, but as a small failure looking for someone patient enough to try again. Inside that office, routine became a kind of music. Letters were examined. Envelopes were checked for clues. Postmarks were studied like tiny travel diaries. A clerk might squint at one blurred line and decide it could be a 7, or it could be a T, and both options implied entirely different destinations. Every time a guess was made, it was written down. The office built a parallel map of the world, not the world as it was, but the world as it was misspelled. The tools of this job were, on the surface, unimpressive. Scissors, knives, tweezers, magnifying glasses, lamps that made paper look pale and serious. There were also stamps, so many stamps, because no matter how mysterious the contents were, the bureaucracy still wanted to label the process. Undeliverable, returned to sender, opened by authority. Those phrases are the administrative equivalent of clearing your throat politely before doing something intrusive. Because yes, at some point, the office might open the letter. Not out of curiosity, at least not officially, but out of necessity. If there was no readable address on the outside, the only hope was that the inside contained a clue. Perhaps a signature, perhaps a receipt with a printed location, perhaps a letterhead. Perhaps, in rare cases, someone had written, "If you're reading this, I forgot the address," which is honest and also not very helpful. Opening letters came with rules. In many places, it was not done casually and not done by just anyone. It could require multiple staff present, like a tiny ceremony of accountability. It might require recording what was found. The goal was not to read for entertainment, because that would be messy, and mess sciences is the enemy of a good filing system. The goal was to find a name, a place, a hint of direction. The letter's private life was treated like a drawer you open only far enough to find the label. Still, you can imagine the soft absurdity of it. A romantic confession trembling on the page, being scanned by a tired clerk looking only for a street name. A business complaint about late deliveries, ironically late itself, being opened in a room devoted to late deliveries. A carefully planned birthday note arriving long after the birthday, becoming less of a greeting and more of a historical document. In those moments, the dead letter office wasn't dramatic. It was quietly ironic, like a calendar that refuses to apologize. Then there were parcels, which are letters that have put on a heavier coat. Parcels contained objects, and objects create a special kind of administrative problem because they take up space and they tempt people. A sealed envelope is light and flat and relatively anonymous. A parcel might rattle. It might smell faintly of soap. It might contain something edible and therefore urgent, which the dead letter office generally did not enjoy. Bureaucracy is not designed for fruit. Undeliverable parcels could sit in storage, tagged and waiting. Some systems eventually auction unclaimed items, because after a certain period, the office had to admit that it was not a museum. Imagine a small public auction where the lots include one pair of gloves, a book with no return address, a curious piece of machinery, and a mysterious box that someone believed would reach its destination if it just tried hard enough. It's like a thrift store curated by miscommunication. Money was another category of trouble. People mailed banknotes, coins, money orders, and later checks, sometimes folded into letters with the confidence that paper envelopes could protect anything. If money was found inside an undeliverable letter, it had to be accounted for with extra care. This led to more forms, more signatures, more locked drawers, more routines designed to prevent temptation from becoming an accidental hobby. And then, of course, there were the tiny human mistakes that repeated themselves so often they became predictable. People would forget to seal the envelope properly, and the letter would spill its contents into the sorting machinery like a shy confession escaping mid-sentence. Labels would fall off. Ink would fade. Some envelopes were recycled, scraped clean, and reused, which sounds resourceful until you realize it also means an old address might still be faintly visible like a ghost of a different destination. The postal system, like any large system, did not fail in spectacular ways most of the time. It failed in small, repeatable ways. The kind you can almost fall asleep to. Some of the most oddly specific work involved redirection. If a letter was addressed correctly but the recipient had moved, the postal system might forward it. But forwarding depends on records. Records depend on people remembering to file things. And people, as a species, are famous for remembering important events and forgetting simple paperwork. So the dead letter office sometimes acted as a secondary forwarding brain, trying to match names to places with whatever scraps the system had collected. This is where it starts to resemble something modern in a gentle way. If you've ever typed a name into a search bar and stared at the suggestions, you already understand the feeling. The system tries to guess what you meant. The difference is that a 19th century clerk did the guessing without autocomplete and with a pen that needed ink. The clerk's version of suggested results might be a notebook of common errors, or a mental list of towns often confused with each other. Not glamorous, but quietly impressive, like someone who can fold fitted sheets without anger. Every so often, the office would run into letters addressed to people who didn't exist, or to titles rather than names. To the best doctor in town, to the man who owes me money, to the minister who will understand. These are technically messages, but they are not deliverable messages. They are like throwing a bottle into the sea and hoping the sea has an organized index of its own waves when letters contain sensitive content, and many did. Because people have always used mail for secrets, the office had to tread carefully. It could not become a gossip engine, at least not officially. Procedures emphasized discretion. Some systems required that open letters be resealed and stamped to show they had been opened properly. It's a little like leaving a polite note on someone's fridge that says, "I looked in here briefly for the milk you asked for," pretending that this makes the invasion of the fridge less intimate. But at least it was documented. And documentation is the comfort blanket of administration. There is also something quietly moving about the idea that so many private thoughts pass through institutional hands. People who would never meet each other were linked by paper pathways. A clerk might see the same style of handwriting repeatedly, the same careful loops, the same kind of ink that faded in the same way, and never know the person behind it. The letter became a small stand-in for someone's presence, and when it failed to arrive, it became a presence without a home, waiting in a drawer. Sometimes the solution was surprisingly mundane. A single missing initial would be corrected because someone recognized the stationery. A town name would be deciphered because the postmark from the previous stop was still visible. The office might consult directories, street maps, business registries. It might send inquiries to local post offices. These inquiries were also letters, of course, which means the dead letter office sometimes used the very system that had failed the letter to rescue the letter. It's like asking a sleepy person to wake up another sleepy person. It can work. It just takes time. Asterisk time, in fact, was the core ingredient. Dead letters were not saved by sudden inspiration. They were saved by slow persistence. A letter could be held for days, weeks, months, depending on the rules and the volume. Some were eventually destroyed because paper piles up, and even the most patient office has limits. But the effort itself tells you something about the world that created it, a world that believed communication was important enough to warrant a whole department devoted to the leftovers. As modern systems developed, the work changed shape. Address standards improved. Return addresses became more common. Later, machine sorting and printed labels reduced some kinds of errors while introducing new ones, because machines are consistent in the way they misunderstand. And eventually, computers took over much of the guesswork, turning names and addresses into database entries. The dead letter office did not vanish so much as evolve, morphing into departments for undeliverable mail, lost parcels, customer service, and, in the gentlest irony, tracking. Even now, in a different form, the same problem persists. Things meant for one person sometimes don't find them. The modern version might be a package that goes to a neighbor, or a message stuck in a spam filter, or a shipping label with one digit wrong. The older version just had more paper and more drawers, and more quiet rooms where people sat under lamps and tried, patiently, to undo the human habit of being slightly imprecise. So if your thoughts are starting to soften at the edges, you can let them. You don't need to solve any mysteries tonight. You don't need to remember any procedures. You can just keep the image of the cabinet, the drawers, the soft shuffle of paper, the gentle determination of a clerk who believes that even a failed letter deserves one more attempt. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let the idea settle somewhere once. Entire careers were spent trying to deliver messages that arrived without a clear destination, and most of that work looked exactly like what it was: quiet, repetitive, and oddly comforting. Like someone straightening a stack of paper until the stack itself feels like a lullaby. After a while, the islands in the meetings and the polite phrases begin to feel like furniture you've lived with too long. You stop noticing them until someone moves a chair and the floor shows a pale rectangle underneath. That's what 1945 does in this kind of story. Not as a bang, not as a cinematic cut, but as a quiet rearranging of labels. Files are still files. Men are still men. Rooms are still rooms. It's just that the sign on the door changes, and everyone pretends they've always called it that. Imagine the headquarters closing the way offices. Usually close, keys returned, Drawers checked twice, one stubborn stamp pad refusing to dry. Some names retire. Some oath books vanish. But address books have a strange survival instinct. They're small enough to slip into a coat pocket, stubborn enough to remain useful, and impolite enough to outlive the person who wrote them. A network doesn't always need a banner to survive. Sometimes it just needs a list of who answers after the third ring, and which back entrance sticks in. Winter dot, it's a gentle trick of history that disbanded, often means refiled. A patriotic society becomes a cultural association, which is the administrative equivalent of putting a hat on the same head and calling it a new person. A lecture series is suddenly about regional heritage. A club that once cared deeply about borders now cares deeply about exchange. The words change their coats, but the stitching patterns feel oddly familiar if you spend enough time staring at old paperwork. And it's hard not to admire the calmness of it all, how smoothly a dangerous noun can become a harmless adjective. Like turning political into educational with a single, well-timed cough. Businesses are helpful here because businesses love continuity. A shipping company that tracked cargo yesterday can track people tomorrow if asked politely and paid quietly. A language school that teaches grammar by day can teach roots by night, and then, after the fire, teach grammar again with even better attendance records. Money has its own memory. It remembers who can move it without asking questions. It remembers whose handwriting looks respectable. It remembers which receipts are intentionally dull. Sometimes the most persistent thing in a network is not ideology at all, but the habit of billing. If you listen closely quietly, you can hear how information starts moving by hand again. Not on banners, not in grand announcements, in notes and introductions, in favors that never get written down because ink is permanent and permanence is unfashionable after a collapse. The early Cold War has a way of inviting familiar guides back into the room. New anxieties, new alliances, and the same old human need for intermediaries. Someone who knows a port, someone who knows a policeman, someone who knows which newspaper editor drinks tea at the same hour every day. And the funny, sleepy detail is that institutions can forget loudly while networks forget slowly. Governments can issue statements. Courts can file verdicts. Newspapers can print the word dissolved in crisp type and feel very satisfied with themselves. But a network is not a building. It's a habit. It's a phone that still rings from the same corner shop. It's a small envelope passed with the same careful fingers. It's a man who used to call himself one thing and now calls himself another, without changing his schedule at all. You can picture the rebranding as a kind of wardrobe change conducted behind a screen. The suit is pressed. The tie is corrected. The old pin is taken off the lapel and tucked into a drawer for personal reasons. Identity becomes less about what you say and more about who still returns your bow. In public, the choreography is smaller, more ceremonious in private rooms, more modest in daylight. In private, the old courtesy remains, because courtesy is useful. It softens suspicion. It turns influence into etiquette, which is harder to prosecute. Breathe in for 4, out for 6, and let this be as boring as it deserves to be. Because what survives 1945, in this quiet corner of shadow politics, is often not a dramatic conspiracy at all. It's paperwork's distant cousin, the address book, the ledger, the contact that never fully expires. The world changes its slogans, and the corridor keeps its footsteps. The phone still rings. The ink still dries. And somewhere, without anyone needing to raise a voice, a familiar network learns to live in smaller print. After the speeches are finished, after the flags have been folded into tidy rectangles, after the last official photograph has been taken at the exact angle that makes everyone look equally temporary, the world does what it always does. It goes back to its paperwork. It goes back to small doors and ordinary staircases and the slow, unromantic business of remembering who knows whom. You can almost hear the building settling, the inkworms in its stone again, as if no one ever tried to burn it out. A geta taps once on wet flagstone. A telegraph, somewhere behind a shoshi, ticks like a heartbeat that refuses to become a headline. If you're listening from a place that is quiet, let it stay that way. Let your shoulders unhook themselves, one small hinge at a time. And if you're still awake by the time we get to the thrilling topic of post-war rebranding, because yes, rebranding can be thrilling in the way a beige folder can be thrilling, feel free to subscribe. Or don't, it's fine. The folders won't notice. They've seen worse than the odd thing about secret societies and the networks that orbit them like sleepy moons is that they rarely end in a satisfying way. They don't explode. They don't deliver a neat moral. They don't even always get caught, which is annoying if you like your history tidy, but very soothing if you like it realistic. More often, they become smaller. They become quieter. They become, in a word, administrative. And administration, as you know, is one of the most effective disguises ever invented by human beings. Who would rather not be discussed? You can picture the years after 1945 as a long corridor with new signage. A door that once said something bold and patriotic now says something careful and cultural. A meeting that once sounded like destiny now sounds like a committee. A society that once gathered around maps and borders now gathers around research, which is a polite word that can mean almost anything if you say it slowly enough. The building changes hands. The street outside changes names. The uniforms vanish or become less uniform. But the habits, those little muscle memories of influence, can linger like the smell of old tobacco in a coat that's been hung up for years. Headquarters. Close the way offices close when someone insists on doing it properly. The lights are turned off in sequence, not because anyone cares, but because someone wrote a checklist a decade ago and the checklist is undefeated. Files are stamped. Keys are counted. Someone discovers a drawer that hasn't been opened since 1932 and finds inside a pencil with a chewed end and a small enameled pin that once meant something. Nobody wants to throw it away, because throwing away an object feels like admitting the past existed. So it gets wrapped in paper and placed in a box labeled miscellaneous, which is history's favorite afterlife, names retire. Or they retire, which is the professional way to say they stop being used in public. Some oaths dissolve into the air the way breath does when it's cold. But address books have a stubborn survival instinct. They are portable. They are useful. They do not moralize. They simply list a name, an alias, a place where a person once answered. A note in the margin, maybe, about which days to avoid calling. The kind of knowledge that doesn't need a manifesto, only a memory and a pen that still works. And then there's the gentle magic, trick of symbolism, how one label can become another without changing the thing underneath. A patriotic society becomes a cultural association. A front becomes a company. A network becomes old acquaintances. If you say it softly enough, it almost sounds like nostalgia. If you file it properly, it becomes acceptable. This is not always dramatic. In fact, it can be painfully dull. There are forms. There are registrations. There are meetings where the most heated conflict is. Whether the new name should include the word foundation, which sounds more respectable but requires slightly different paperwork. Sometimes. The most memorable part is how deliberately boring the new public face becomes. The lectures turn into lectures about heritage or morality or the importance of good posture. The pamphlets, if they still exist, begin to look like harmless civic advice. How to be a good neighbor, how to respect tradition, how to keep the city clean. And the funny thing is, those topics aren't even fake. They're just convenient. A network doesn't need to lie about everything. It only needs to be vague enough that no one can ask the wrong question without sounding rude. The money doesn't vanish. Either. Money rarely vanishes. It changes its shoes. It finds a new doorway. It learns new manners. If a language school can teach grammar by day and roots by night, it can also teach grammar again after the war. And nobody feels suspicious because grammar is, famously, not a crime. A shipping office that tracks cargo can track other things too, simply because it already owns the habit of tracking. Receipts remain dull on purpose. Budgets continue to hide muscle under tea and printing costs. The envelopes get smaller. The sums get more carefully explained. But the motion, the quiet slide of influence from hand to hand keeps its rhythm. Asterisk. You might not expect the most persistent remnant of a shadow network to be a perfectly normal business transaction. But there is something almost soothing about the idea that history's dramatic periods are often supported by the same boring scaffolding, rent paid on time, a room reserved upstairs, a man hired because he is reliable, which is another word that can mean almost anything. Reliability in these stories is sometimes the highest virtue. Not goodness, not courage, reliability, the ability to show up, to keep quiet, to deliver what was asked for without making the mistake of a personal opinion. And then there is the relationship between networks and institutions, which is an endlessly sleepy topic, like listening to two slow rivers meet. Institutions forget loudly. Networks forget slowly. A government can issue a statement. A newspaper can print the word dissolved in crisp type and feel very proud. A court can declare something illegal and imagine the matter is finished. But a network is not only an organization. It is a set of relationships. It is etiquette. It is who bows first, who pours the tea, who pretends to be surprised. You cannot dissolve etiquette with a proclamation. You can only rearrange it. You can imagine the old couriers becoming intermediaries, which sounds like a job you list on a resume with polite confidence. They are not couriers, not anymore. They are consultants. They connect people who would like to be connected. They advise. They introduce. They know which restaurant has the private room that never quite appears on the printed floor plan. They know which policeman prefers to be thanked indirectly. They know which editor is always awake at dawn. None of this requires a banner. It requires only patience and the ability to say, "Ah yes, a mutual friend," without flinching. The early Cold War, in particular, has a way of creating demand for familiar guides. When the world splits into anxious halves, everyone suddenly needs experts in things they pretend not to do. Influence, persuasion, quiet pressure. It is not always clear who hires whom. It is not always clear who is using who. Sometimes it's simply a convergence of needs. A state wants stability. A group wants survival. A businessman wants advantage. The result is not a grand conspiracy so much as a long series of small bargains, each one justified as practical, which is the word people use when they don't want to describe the moral shape of what they're doing. A mildly strange fact, if you enjoy mildly strange facts, is that the line between political and criminal can blur in a way that is less like a fog and more like a polite curtain. In some corners, the same men appear at different tables depending on the decade. Sometimes they arrive as patriots, sometimes as brokers, sometimes as guardians of order. Sometimes they arrive simply because they know how to move through a city without being noticed, which is a skill that rarely goes out of fashion. And if you're thinking, this is all very unsettling, remember, we are not here for urgency. We are here for the slow, unexciting mechanics of it. The way a clock ticks without meaning anything personally toward you. Consider, for a moment how a scandal works in this kind of world. The scandal is rarely the event itself. The scandal is the timing. The scandal is who decides it becomes public and when. And that too can be managed like a timetable. A threatened scandal becomes support. A promised rally becomes restraint. The outcome feels inevitable, not because fate is real, but because the corridor decided before the room did. Elections tilt by inches, funds, rumors, endorsements, none large enough alone to leave a bruise. But together, they create a gentle pressure that moves the furniture. This can be so boring that you almost miss it. That's the beauty of it, really. Influence, at its most effective, does not look like power. It looks like common sense. It looks like the way things are done. It looks like a minister hearing public sentiment before the public has even finished forming it. It looks like a petition arriving with ink still damp, as if the air itself was eager to participate. And somewhere, behind the scenes, someone is not raising their voice. They are adjusting intervals. They are steering moods. They are letting decisions feel like the people made them themselves, which is one of the oldest tricks in the book, and also one of the least exciting to watch if you were hoping for drama.now. If you'd like something truly tender and pointless, imagine the daily maintenance of secrecy after a war. Not the thrilling parts, no chases, no coded messages hidden in pastries, just the maintenance. The constant small effort of not being known. The careful choice of words when speaking on a telephone, because telephones have ears even when the person on the other end is friendly. The habit of meeting in rooms with more than one exit, not because you expect trouble, but because you prefer options. The way men learn to tell stories that contain nothing actionable. Only atmosphere. There is a particular kind of person who thrives in that atmosphere. The man who can talk for 10 minutes and reveal nothing. Like a radio announcer describing weather that never arrives. He becomes indispensable. He can attend different circles and remain the same person. In one decade, he is a patriot. In another, he is a cultural organizer. In another, he is an elderly gentleman who knows everyone and is always invited to the right weddings. If you've ever watched a person who is very good at networking at a modern workplace, you have seen the harmless version of this skill. They remember names. They remember drinks. They remember birthdays. They remember that your cousin is looking for a job. The difference is mostly in what the job is. Even the symbols survive sometimes, but they shrink. They become personal. A pin becomes a tie clip. A motto becomes a joke told among old friends. A river name becomes a story. Ah yes, the Black Dragon, someone says. As if it's just geography, as if geography never carried politics in its pockets. The Amur, the Heilongjiang, two names for one river. A reminder that borders can be argued over with maps or with language, and sometimes language is cheaper. A map can be folded. A word can be whispered. Both can outlast the hands that use them.